this piece, as opposed to the floral freehand decoration, I'm going to do something a little bit more grid and pattern based, whereas what I'm talking about here is something more linear, horizontally aligned, linearly aligned. So it's going to be a repeat mark that actually creates, in a sense, similar to wallpaper or rug patterns, fiber patterns. It's going to be something that overlays the surface. So it's not so much about recreating a natural feeling the same way we were with this cup, but it's actually about creating a much more graphic pattern. So in this case, and this can be any mark, I would encourage all of you just to play with brushes and see what they can do. What happens when you press lightly and pull fast? What happens when you press hard and pull slow, and every variation in between? Learn your tools, learn how to use the brushes in terms of their ability to change the thinness and thickness, the pulling and the bunching, in a sense, of that mark, of this pigment. So in this case, with this cup, what I've got is it's slightly squared, so I actually have 4 reference points, in a sense, to base that grid on. Now later what I'll be doing is actually drawing grids on the surfaces with pencil to get a much more precise layout. In this case, I'm not so interested in that. I want a little bit more of that spontaneity that the brush provides, and I want to be able to change or make decisions during the actual composition as opposed to mapping it out too much ahead of time. And so I think for this I'll just start and see where it goes. And I love this mark. You'll see me use this mark over and over and over again, and it's a simple press down with the brush and quick lift, almost like you're making a check mark. Now, for me, what this does is this actually has the fatter parts of these marks are really attractive the way it goes from that thick to thin. But I also want to feel like there's something bunching up in the middle. This feels like there's too much open space. It feels like there's tension, but maybe it's even, that tension is so great it's torn the pattern. I want to kind of connect this pattern a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is then go back, make the same mark, but in the opposite direction. So that'll be the start of the first one. Now I can continue this and actually, in a sense, create a zigzag around the whole cup. But what I could also do, sometimes I think what can add a lot of strength to patterns is when you use certain devices, for instance, offsetting patterns, or maybe making changes or switches midway through the pattern. What it does is it just creates tension within that composition, and it can often be a really interesting visual element to the pot. So what I'm going to do is start on this next panel, and instead of continuing this zigzag, I'm actually going to offset the zigzag and go in between the spaces I just painted. So for instance, instead of starting the mark here, I'll move up a little bit and start it there. That way, as I continue around the cup, you'll begin to see this offset pattern. Now, I'm just going to sketch out the base of the pattern. If I need to go back into certain spaces and fill in areas, I'll do that at the end. One of my purposes here is not to be completely precise. This is actually about having a looseness and a casualness to the pattern that's going to be very different than some of the work you'll see later. I actually am trying not to be precise here. I want there to be variation. What will happen is when this is glazed and fired, this black will actually streak. It'll streak blue. That will create a lot of interesting pulling and stretching of the pigment, which this casualness, I believe in the mark making, actually helps the overall design. Now, I also feel like on some pieces it's important on every piece actually to consider what the relationship is between not only the form and the surface, but also the specifics of the form and the surface. For instance, does the decoration wrap around the lip or the foot? Does it stop? Do I create a border? Do I erase all the borders and allow the whole thing to even continue onto the interior of the cup all the way down to the bottom? And these are all really important questions that you as an individual need to answer for your own work. I personally go between all of these different possibilities depending on the piece. Each one I assess and base that difference on how I actually want that decoration to function on the piece. So for instance, on this cup, I think what I like is I like the decoration to wrap over just a little bit. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've got the basic pattern brushed out on the surface, I'm just going to come back a little bit, and I'm going to let that pattern wrap around the interior of the cup. So I'm just going to follow what I've already established and wrap it entirely around the lip of the cup, just one interval down. So what I mean by that is I'm only going to go down one level of brush marks. I'm not going to continue the pattern all the way into the interior. I'm just going to let this first kind of vanguard of marks wrap around the lip.